Welcome back. I know many of you are trying to get a handle on the big forces reshaping, well, everything, the global economy, geopolitics.
Yeah, it feels like a lot is shifting under our feet.
Definitely. So today we're doing a deep dive, drawing heavily on geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan's work. Think of it as a quick way to get up to speed on some really crucial changes.
Absolutely. Zion's perspective, especially from his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, is powerful because he connects the dots. Geography, demographics, economics, politics, they're all linked.
And it paints a picture of a world moving away from that post-World War II order we've known for so long.
Exactly, a fundamental shift.
So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from Zeihan's view, how the world worked, why, and what might be coming next. Let's start with his idea of geography as a success. What's the core concept there?
Okay, so at its heart, it's about how easily a society can move stuff, goods, resources within its own borders,
Yeah.
and just as importantly, how easily it can access things from outside.
Right. Internal transport and external access.
Precisely. Think about ancient Egypt, one of his examples. Success came from agriculture packed along the Nile, easy to manage, predictable water. Plus, they were pretty isolated geographically.
So concentration and control were key early on.
Yeah, but that model had, limitations. It couldn't easily scale up or project power far beyond the Nile Valley, really. Not until the industrial age changed the game with new transport and tech.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. The age of empires, say 15th to 19th centuries, how did the geography of success change then?
Well, capital becomes a huge deal, generating wealth to invest. And waterways, absolutely critical.
Because shipping by water was just so much cheaper.
Massively cheaper. It opened up trade on a whole new scale. And access to the sea meant access to other cultures, other economies, new ideas. So success became much more about maritime access and the capital to exploit it.
Which brings us closer to the modern era, the post-World War II setup dominated by the U.S. This sounds like a really radical shift in how geography mattered.
Oh, absolutely radical. The U.S. Basically used its massive navy, particularly after WWII, to guarantee open ocean access. For everyone.
Just allies.
For everyone. Allies, rivals didn't matter in that sense. The idea was keep the sea lanes open, keep trade flowing, and that would contain the Soviets and build prosperity. It essentially decoupled trade from immediate military security for many countries.
Something totally new in history, really.
Completely. And it fueled this massive wave of globalization. The Soviet Union, of course, was largely outside this system. They faced very different geographic and economic constraints, a much harder road.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Globalization takes off, powered by this U.S. security guarantee. And the other huge piece you mentioned is demographics. How do these two connect?
They're like two sides of the same coin in Zeihan's view. Before the war, to be a major power, you kind of needed everything domestically. Oil, iron ore, coal, enough food. Or you risked being, well, a colony or dependent.
You needed the whole package.
Right. But globalization changed that. Suddenly you could specialize. Got lots of oil? Great. Trade it for food or industrial goods. This allowed countries all over the world to industrialize really fast, trading for whatever key resource they lacked.
And that industrialization pulled people off farms and into cities.
Massively. Urbanization took off globally. And that's where the demographic shift kicks in hard.
Because city life changes family economics.
Totally. On the farm, kids are basically free labor. More hands are better in the city. Kids are expensive. Education, housing, food, it all costs way more.
So people started having fewer children.
Exactly. Birth rates plummeted across the industrialized world. And fast forward a few decades, that leads directly to aging populations.
Which is where we are now, seeing the consequences.
Right. In the 2000s, 2010s, you had lots of rich countries, aging workforces, but maybe not enough young consumers domestically, so they became export powerhouses.
Relying on selling to others.
But now, we're in the thick of the mass retirement wave. Baby boomers are leaving the workforce in droves in places like Germany, China, Korea, Italy, Japan.
And that causes a double whammy, fewer workers and fewer consumers.
Exactly. Zeihan's point is stark. There's no proven economic model for a society that's shrinking in both its labor force and its consumer base across all age groups. He argues their current systems are basically unsustainable. The math just doesn't work long term.
A shrinking workforce, fewer buyers, a fundamental imbalance, and this demographic crunch hits just as globalization itself seems to be weakening. Why does Zion see that era ending?
Well, think about what sustained it. You needed a big player, willing and able to police the sea lanes with a relatively young population to support that role and buy the goods. That was the U.S. after 1945.
But U.S. priorities are changing.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
Recent administrations, and he includes Biden here, have shifted towards more nationalist, America First type economic policies. Populism is a factor. The willingness to underwrite the global system just isn't there in the same way.
So the guarantor is stepping back.
Pretty much, making the old model very unlikely to continue.
And you mentioned inflation earlier. How does this connect to what we're feeling in our wallets? Is it all just government spending?
Zeihan argues a big chunk of it isn't. It's structural. It's the baby boomers retiring globally. That's a massive loss of workers, hitting supply.
Fewer people making things.
Exactly. And at the same time, these retirees are starting to draw down their savings, liquidating assets. So you get a squeeze on labor, potentially less investment capital floating around, even as demand in some areas might remain high or shift. It's inflationary pressure from the supply side and the capital side.
And the U.S. response seems to be bring manufacturing back home, reindustrialize.
Yes, that's a major policy push. The Biden administration talks about doubling U.S. industrial capacity. It's partly a reaction to seeing supply chains break down and partly anticipating that places like China and Germany won't be the manufacturing hubs they once were because of their demographic and energy problems.
But trying to build factories when you already have a worker shortage?
That's the rub. Doing that is almost guaranteed to keep upward pressure on wages and prices. Sustained inflation seems likely in that scenario.
Okay, if demographics are such a challenge, what about immigration? Isn't that the obvious release valve, especially for the U.S.?
It seems obvious, right? And long term, yes, it absolutely could be. But Zeihan points out some near-term hurdles.
Oh, such as?
Well, first, our biggest historical source, Mexico. Their own birth rate has dropped significantly. They're industrializing too. Net migration from Mexico to the U.S. has actually gone way down.
So we can't rely on that historical flow anymore.
Not in the same way. To get large numbers of immigrants now, especially skilled ones, you'd likely need to recruit more from the Eastern Hemisphere. And that requires a conscious, deliberate immigration policy overhaul passed by Congress.
Which seems unlikely anytime soon, given the politics.
Exactly. He highlights the political gridlock. Both parties are kind of wrestling with organized labor's concerns about immigration's impact on wages. So there's this tug of war.
And no easy consensus.
Right. Zeihan basically predicts significant reform probably won't happen until after the 2028 election cycle, which means we might be missing a window right now when global talent might be looking to move due to instability elsewhere.
So potential solution, but politically stuck for now. This whole picture feels pretty disruptive. Does Zeihan worry about democracy itself, in the U.S. or globally?
Interestingly, for the U.S., he's not sounding huge alarm bells. He frames the current political chaos, the polarization, the fights, as more of a normal, albeit messy, generational transition.
Normal. It feels pretty crazy sometimes.
He compares it to previous periods, like the 1930s. Says party systems have broken down and realigned 6 times before in U.S. history. It's a pattern.
And he sees signs of moderation.
He points to the midterms, suggesting voters often pull things back to the center. He views Biden, compared to his immediate predecessors, as a more stabilizing figure in that context. But what underpins that U.S. optimism, given the global picture?
Right. Why is the U.S. potentially more resilient?
Fundamentally, it goes back to those geographic advantages. Secure borders, navigable rivers, resources, and, crucially, better demographics than most other developed countries. He sees the political stuff as turbulence on the surface, but the underlying structure is strong. That's his read, anyway.
Okay, but his view changes when looking outward.
Oh, definitely. If global trade really does break down like he thinks it might, the economic pain in many countries could be immense, far worse than typical recessions. And that kind of economic stress, it absolutely puts pressure on democratic systems.
Any specific countries he's particularly worried about?
Germany comes up repeatedly. The hit from losing cheap Russian natural gas, which was like 40% of their supply, is just enormous.
Because natural gas is hard to replace quickly.
Extremely. The market isn't elastic. Prices went up, what, 6-fold? And it's not just heating. It hits electricity costs and, critically, petrochemicals, the absolute foundation for their entire advanced manufacturing model.
So the core of the German economy is threatened. That sounds incredibly serious. How fast could that unravel?
His timeline is startlingly fast. He suggests the German manufacturing model could face collapse within, say, the next 2 years. Losing affordable energy, facing demographic decline. It's a perfect storm. And he has a historical note. Severe economic stress in Germany has often led to significant instability.
A very sobering thought. Okay, amidst this potential chaos, are there any upsides? Any countries or regions poised to do relatively well as globalization recedes?
Yes, it's not all doom. The flip side of globalization ending is that local geography starts to matter more again.
So back to basics in a way.
Sort of.
Mm.
And the U.S., again, looks well-positioned. Strong demographics, ocean access on both sides, resources, and a growing economic partnership with Mexico. Potential for big growth in industry, agriculture, energy.
Anywhere else?
He points to Scandinavia.
Mm.
They're not tightly locked into the EU energy grid, have their own North Sea resources, good ties with the UK and US, could form their own economic bloc, perhaps.
And in Asia?
Japan is interesting. Terrible demographics, yes.
Mm.
But they saw the writing on the wall decades ago.
How so?
They started what Zeihan calls desourcing back in the mid-90s, building supply chains, investing heavily in countries they saw as reliable, long-term partners, basically aligning with the U.S. in a friends and family network. A very deliberate long-term strategy.
Proactive.
Very. And Southeast Asia generally looks good. Young populations poised to pick up manufacturing slack from China and Europe, plus growing internal consumer markets. So it's not an end, it's a transition. Back to a world maybe more like pre-1945, with different winners and losers.
It sounds like the stability we took for granted was built on quite specific and maybe temporary conditions then.
That's a key takeaway from his analysis, yeah. The Pax Americana allowed a certain kind of global system to flourish, but the foundations are shifting.
You mentioned Japan's desourcing. Could other countries copy that playbook now if they see the trouble coming?
They can try, but the big challenge is time. Japan started 30 years ago. It was a state-driven strategy for national survival, anticipating their demographic crunch.
So latecomers might have different motives.
Probably more corporate-driven now. Companies scrambling to secure suppliers or find consumers, rather than a grand national strategy. Maybe smaller, nimble countries like the UK or the Netherlands could pull off something similar on a smaller scale.
But for a giant like Germany, too late.
Likely too late to replicate Japan's success on that scale. The demographic hole is too deep. The financial pressures are mounting now. You see desperate moves already, like the chemical giant BASF shutting down major plants in Germany and moving production to Louisiana. That tells you a lot.
Wow. Okay, shifting gears slightly, Russia and Ukraine. How does Zeihan's geographic and demographic lens apply there?
For him, Russia's actions are deeply rooted in geography. Their lack of easily defensible borders means they've historically tried to push outwards, control buffer zones, secure access points like ports, standard Russian strategic thinking for centuries.
But why now? The timing.
Demographics again. Russia's facing a steep decline in the number of young men eligible for military service in the coming years. The window to use military force for these strategic goals, in their view, was closing.
A demographic deadline driving geopolitical action. Makes sense in that framework. Okay, the big question everyone asks. If this is the changing landscape, where does Zeihan suggest putting money? Understanding he's not a financial advisor, of course.
Right. Big caveat there. His pre-Ukraine thinking focused on companies plugged into the North American system. U.S.-based supply chains, especially benefiting from cheap U.S. shale energy, so energy-intensive industries.
Like what?
Petrochemicals, food processing, energy processing itself,
Right.
things benefiting from U.S.-Mexican demographic demand, and also export potential from a secure, low-cost base.
And has the Ukraine war changed that view?
It's added a layer. He's become more interested in commodities generally as global supply chains get disrupted. But with extreme caution about who you invest in, global giants with big assets tied up in risky places like Russia or Ukraine, maybe not so attractive.
So knowing where a company's stuff actually is becomes crucial.
Absolutely critical. Geographic exposure. It's a muscle investors haven't had to flex much during peak globalization, but it's essential now. And we need to learn it fast.
You know, thinking about labor shortages, it's almost cocktail party chatter now, isn't it? Like, why is it so hard sometimes to find staff at, say, a fast food place like KFC? What's the deep reason there?
It's a perfect microcosm of these bigger trends. It's not just one thing, it's a convergence.
Okay, break it down.
First, you've got the huge baby boomer cohort retiring, largest generation checking out. Second, the generation entering the workforce now, Gen Z, is much smaller, just fewer bodies available.
So a basic numbers gap.
A big one. And it hits hardest at the entry level, low-skill jobs, and also at the high-skill end, interestingly. Then layer on top of that the reindustrialization push we talked about.
More factories opening, needing workers.
Exactly, in both the US and Mexico. So suddenly there's way more competition for those same entry-level workers who are already in short supply. Fast food is competing with new manufacturing jobs.
Smaller pool of workers, more jobs competing for them. Simple, but powerful.
Bingo. That's why your local KFC might be short-staffed. It's demographics meeting industrial policy right there at the counter.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, the main takeaway from diving into Zion's perspective is this really profound shift. We're moving out of that post-war globalization phase, and it's being driven by these deep, powerful forces of geography and demographics.
Precisely. And understanding those underlying currents, even if you don't agree with every prediction, gives you really valuable context for just navigating what's coming.
Yeah,
Because the future probably looks quite different from the recent past.
it certainly seems that way. So, on that note, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Take a moment and really consider how these huge geopolitical and demographic shifts we've talked about might actually touch your life, your job, your career path, maybe your investments. What could these new geographies of success mean for you personally? And what else might you want to dig into after hearing all this today?